Dilexi Te, Pope Leo the XIV's Apostolic Exhortation. The opening words of his Apostolic Exhortation, Dilexi Te, I have loved you. My dear sisters and brothers, this very first Apostolic Exhortation of Pope Leo XIV, which he signed on the feast of St Francis of Assisi, the 4th of October this year, and which was promulgated and published on the 9th of October this year, on the feast day of St. John Henry Newman. We start with a simple question. What is an apostolic exhortation? An apostolic exhortation is an important document issued by a Holy Father, by the Pope. Through this document, the Holy Father chooses to exhort, to encourage, to urge the Church, the Christian community, to live profoundly and in a committed manner a particular virtue or to live the Christian life fully. Over the past few decades, the Holy Fathers have written encyclicals and apostolic exhortations, especially on matters of social concern. Our next question is, what does Dilexi Te mean? Dilexi Te, the opening words of this apostolic exhortation of Pope Leo XIV, mean, I have loved you. These are the words of Jesus himself, who speaks these words in the book of Revelation, chapter 3, verse 9, to one of the earliest Christian communities that was struggling with poverty and was suffering. They are very meaningful, profound words of the Lord himself. And so it's best to listen to the opening words and the opening lines of this apostolic exhortation. The Holy Father, Pope Leo XIV, begins the apostolic exhortation with the words, Dilexi Te, I have loved you. Revelation 3:9. The Lord speaks these words to a Christian community that, unlike some others, had no influence or resources and was treated instead with violence and contempt. You have but little power. I will make them come and bow down before your feet. Revelation chapter 3, verses 8 to 9. The Holy Father continues, this text reminds us of the words of the Canticle of Mary. He cast down the mighty from their thrones and lifted up the lowly. He has filled the hungry with good things and sent the rich away empty. Luke 1, 52 to 53. Now, just as Pope Francis, in his very first year in his papacy, completed the exhortation that was started by Pope Benedict XVI, Lumen Fidei, similarly, Pope Leo XIV now completes the work Pope Francis had started before his death. And so with the release of this very first document, this apostolic exhortation, this magisterial teaching, in the very first months of his papacy, we read Pope Leo's development, his thoughts, his ideas on the Christian life for our time, both in humble continuity with Pope Francis and yet at the same time offering his own personal style and experience. This apostolic exhortation has 5 chapters and begins with a very brief introduction wherein the Holy Father underlines the close connection between Christ's love and Christ's summons to care for the poor. The Holy Father says, I consider it essential to insist on this path to holiness. For, in this call to recognize Christ in the poor and the suffering, we see revealed the very heart of Christ, His deepest feelings and choices, which every saint seeks to imitate. Number 3. Let's take a look at each of the chapters briefly of this apostolic exhortation. Dilexi Te, I have loved you, addressed to all Christians on care for the poor. In chapter 1, entitled A Few Essential Words, the Holy Father begins with an explanation of that gesture of the woman who poured costly perfumed oil on the head of the Lord Jesus. Matthew 26, 8-9 and verse 11. The simplicity of the woman's gesture speaks volumes, says the Holy Father. No sign of affection, even the smallest, will ever be forgotten, especially if it is shown to those who are suffering, lonely, or in need, as was the Lord at that moment. The Holy Father categorically states that love for the Lord, then, is one with love for the poor. In the poor, the Lord continues to speak to us. Signed on the feast of St Francis of Assisi, through this document, the Holy Father imparts the lesson that St Francis of Assisi learned personally and embodied, that a preferential love for the marginalized can renew both the church and society, and that even today, St Francis of Assisi, the poor man of Assisi, continues to inspire us by his outstanding example. The Holy Father then has 5 paragraphs in this chapter on the cry of the poor, wherein in number 9 he explains that the condition of the poor is a cry that throughout human history constantly challenges our lives, our societies, political and economic systems, and, not least, the church. On the wounded faces of the poor, we see the suffering of the innocent, and therefore the suffering of Christ Himself. Pope Leo explains very vividly that there are many forms of poverty. I quote, "The poverty of those who lack material means of subsistence, the poverty of those who are socially marginalized and lack the means to give voice to their dignity and abilities, moral and spiritual poverty, cultural poverty, the poverty of those who find themselves in a condition of personal or social weakness or fragility, the poverty of those who have no rights, no space, no freedom." That's number 9. In number 12, he very powerfully calls us not to let our guard down with regard to poverty. He states, and again I quote, "We must not let our guard down when it comes to poverty. We should be particularly concerned about the serious conditions in which many people find themselves due to a lack of food and water. In wealthy countries too, the growing numbers of the poor are equally a source of concern. In general, we are witnessing an increase in different kinds of poverty, which is no longer a single, uniform reality, but now involves multiple forms of economic and social impoverishment, reflecting the spread of inequality even in largely affluent contexts." He cautions, "Let us not forget that doubly poor are those women who endure situations of exclusion, mistreatment, and violence, since they are frequently less able to defend their rights. Even so, we constantly witness among them impressive examples of daily heroism in defending and protecting their vulnerable families. Pope Leo goes on to challenge us when he says, "We say one thing with our words, but our decisions and reality tell another story, especially if we consider the numbers of women who are in fact destitute." Pope Leo concludes this section with a call to go back to the gospel and to reread the gospel. The poor cannot be neglected if we are to remain within the great current of the Church's life that has its source in the gospel and bears fruit in every time and space. Chapter 2, entitled God Chooses the Poor. In this chapter, the Holy Father has a profound reflection on the choice of the poor right through the Scriptures, where he shows that God's heart has a special place for the poor. The entire history of our redemption is marked by the presence of the poor. Number 17. The Pope explains clearly how Jesus was not only a poor Messiah, but also as the Messiah of and for the poor. Number 21. He asks a challenging question in number 23. I quote, "I often wonder, even though the teaching of sacred scripture is so clear about the poor, why many people continue to think that they can safely disregard the poor." He then goes on to draw out examples of mercy towards the poor in the Bible. In chapter 3, entitled A Church for the Poor, the Holy Father starts with the words of Pope Francis. "How I would like a church which is poor and for the poor." Pope Leo reiterates in number 36 what Pope Francis stated in Evangelii Gaudium. I quote, "There can be no room for doubt or for explanations that weaken so clear a message. We have to state, without mincing words, that there is an inseparable bond between our faith and the poor." Pope Leo then goes on to show with many examples how through 2 millennia the disciples of Christ have witnessed to their faith in love for the poor. He draws on the teachings of St. Paul, the example of the deacon Lawrence, who, when challenged by Roman authorities to bring the treasures of the church, he did, as he brought the poor of the city and presented them to the Roman authorities and said, "Here, these are the treasures of the church, the poor." He quotes from St. Ambrose. He cites the examples of different fathers of the church, going back to Ignatius of Antioch, Justin the Martyr, John Chrysostom, and St. Augustine. How each of them spelt out the close link between our faith and love for the poor. He emphasizes that patristic theology was practical, aiming at a church that was poor and for the poor, recalling that the gospel is proclaimed correctly only when it impels us to touch the flesh of the least among us, and warns that doctrinal vigor without mercy is empty talk. Doctrinal rigor without mercy is empty talk. Number 48. He continues in this chapter to speak about examples of care for the sick in the lives of so many saints, as well as care for the poor in monastic life. He very powerfully states in number 58 that monastic life, if faithful to its original vocation, shows that the Church is fully the bride of the Lord only when she is sister of the poor. The cloister, he says, is not only a refuge from the world, but a school where to learn to serve the world better. Where monks and nuns have opened their doors to the poor, the Church has revealed with humility and firmness that contemplation does not exclude mercy, but demands it as its purest fruit. The Holy Father cites many examples of different saints and their care for prisoners, obviously quoting the example of Pope Francis, his own personal example of visiting prisoners in the prisons of Rome. He then takes up evangelical poverty in religious life, a vow lived by so many religious congregations, and that their example teaches us that the Church is a light when she strips herself of everything, and that holiness passes through a humble heart devoted to the least among us. Number 67. From number 68 to 72, the Holy Father draws on the history of the Church's education of the poor through so many male and female religious congregations, emphasizing that for the Christian faith, the education of the poor is not a favor, but rather it is a duty. From number 73 to 75, the Holy Father presents the Church's response to migrant people. The experience of migration accompanies the history of the people of God, and Pope Leo says, citing the biblical examples of Abraham, Moses, the Holy Family itself in their flight to Egypt, and Christ Jesus himself in coming to live amongst us. He makes it clear that welcoming migrants is therefore a crucial part of the Church's mission, stating, and I quote, "The Church, like a mother, accompanies those who are walking. Where the world sees threats, the Church sees children. Where walls are built, she builds bridges. She knows that her proclamation of the gospel is credible only when it is translated into gestures of closeness and welcome. And she knows that in every rejected migrant, it is Christ himself who knocks at the door of the community." Number 75. In referring to the examples of the saints who reached out to the least and most abandoned, he offers the example of Mother Teresa of Calcutta. He states, "Christian holiness often flourishes in the most forgotten and wounded places of humanity. The poorest of the poor, those who lack not only material goods, but also a voice and the recognition of their dignity, have a special place in God's heart. They are the beloved of the gospel, the heirs to the kingdom." Luke 6:20. "It is in them that Christ continues to suffer and rise again. It is in them that the Church rediscovers her call to show her most authentic self." Number 76. He has a final word in this chapter about the many popular movements that reach out and work for the poor, cautioning that if politicians and professionals do not listen to these movements, democracy atrophies, turns into a slogan, a formality. It loses its representative character and becomes disembodied, since it leaves out the people in their daily struggle for dignity in the building of their future. The same must be said, he goes on, about the institutions of the Church, the need to heed the work done by popular lay movements. In chapter 4, entitled A History That Continues, the Holy Father takes us through the Church's social doctrine. It's 150 years of social teaching, which he says is a veritable treasury of significant teaching concerning the poor. Beginning with Pope Leo XIII's famous encyclical Rerum Novarum, to Mater et Magister of John the 23rd, to Vatican II's Gaudium et Spes, to Paul VI, Populorum Progressio, to John Paul II's Solicitudo Rei Socialis and Laborem in Exercens, to Benedict XVI in Caritas in Veritate, and concluding with Pope Francis in Evangelii Gaudium, Laudato Si, and Fratelli Tutti. He also takes us through the Latin American Bishops' Conference, important documents at certain key moments of meeting of the Latin American Bishops' Conference assemblies. These meetings and documents have influenced the life of the Church in understanding her call for care to the poor. For example, the conference at Medellin, the conference in Puebla, the conference in Santo Domingo, and above all, the conference assembly in Aparecida in Brazil, which were significant events for the life of the Church as a whole and offering teaching on the Church's relationship with the poor. He cites the example of Saint Archbishop Oscar Romero. In this context, Romero remains a powerful witness and an inspiration for the Church, as he made his own the plight of the vast majority of his flock and made them the center of his pastoral vision. The Holy Father then takes up the issue of structures of sin and extreme poverty and emphasizes the need to be increasingly committed to resolving the structural causes of poverty. He reiterates that inequality is the root of social evil and that human rights in practice are not equal for all. Number 94. He finally, in this section, quotes from the Aparecida document of the Latin American Bishops' Conference. He says, "The stark difference between the rich and poor invite us to work with greater commitment to being disciples capable of sharing the table of life, the table of all the sons and daughters of the Father, a table that is open and inclusive, from which no one is excluded. We therefore reaffirm our preferential and evangelical option for the poor." Number 99. Pope Leo reaffirms the Christological centrality of the Church's preferential option for the poor. And he further explains that, and I quote, "All this entails one aspect of the option for the poor that we must constantly keep in mind, namely, that it demands of us an attitude of attentiveness to others. This loving attentiveness is the beginning of a true concern for their person, which inspires me effectively to seek their good. This entails appreciating the poor in their goodness, in their experience of life, in their culture, and in their ways of living the faith. True love is always contemplative and permits us to serve the other not out of necessity or vanity, but rather because he or she is beautiful above and beyond mere appearance. Only on the basis of this real and sincere closeness can we properly accompany the poor in their path of liberation. Pope Leo beautifully recognizes the lives of those people who have chosen to live among the poor. He says, "For this reason I express my heartfelt gratitude to all those who have chosen to live among the poor, not merely to pay an occasional visit, but to live with them as they do. Such a decision should be deemed as one of the highest forms of evangelical life. Number 101. In chapter 5, which is a conclusion entitled A Constant Challenge, Pope Leo affirms that no Christian can regard the poor simply as a social problem. They are part of our family. They are one of us. Nor can our relationship to the poor be reduced to merely another ecclesial activity or function. Again, he quotes from the Aparecida document, which says, "We are asked to devote time to the poor, to give them loving attention, to listen to them with interest, to stand by them in difficult moments, choosing to spend hours, weeks, or years of our lives with them, and striving to transform their situations, starting from them." We cannot forget that this is what Jesus himself proposed in his actions and by his words. Then Pope Leo takes up the parable of the Good Samaritan in the Gospel of Luke, chapter 10, verses 25 to 37. And using the words and questions of Pope Francis in Fratelli Tutti that emerge from the parable and its relevance for us today, for example, which of these persons do you identify with? What did the Good Samaritan do? He says, these questions become all the more urgent in the light of a serious flaw present in the life of our societies, but also in our Christian communities. The many forms of indifference we see all around us are in fact signs of an approach to life that is spreading in various and subtle ways. What is more, caught up as we are with our own needs, the sight of a person who is suffering disturbs us. It makes us uneasy, since we have no time to waste on other people's problems. These are symptoms, he says, of an unhealthy society. A society that seeks prosperity but turns its back on suffering. May we not sink to such depths. Let us look to the example of the Good Samaritan. The final words of the parable, "Go and do likewise," Luke 10:37, represent a mandate, says Pope Leo, that every Christian must daily take to heart. In Numbers 112 to 114, the Holy Father is quite categorical when he states that at times Christian movements or groups have arisen which show little or no interest in the common good of society and in particular the protection and advancement of its most vulnerable and disadvantaged members. Yet we must never forget that religion, especially the Christian religion, cannot be limited to the private sphere, as if believers had no business making their voice heard with regard to the problems affecting civil society and issues concerning its members. The Holy Father has a few words finally on almsgiving, which is part of our Christian tradition. He explains the purpose of almsgiving. He says, "Those inspired by true charity know full well that almsgiving does not absolve the competent authorities of their responsibilities, eliminate the duty of government institutions to care for the poor, or detract from rightful efforts to ensure justice. Almsgiving at least offers us a chance to halt before the poor, to look into their eyes, to touch them, and to share something of ourselves with them. In any event, almsgiving, however modest, brings a touch of pietas into a society otherwise marked by the frenetic pursuit of personal gain. In the words of the book of Proverbs, those who are generous are blessed, for they share the bread with the poor. Proverbs 22:9. So Pope Leo calls on the entire Christian community, saying, we Christians must not abandon almsgiving. It can be done in different ways, and surely more effectively, but it must continue to be done. It is always better at least to do something rather than nothing. Whatever form it may take, almsgiving will touch and soften our hardened hearts. It will not solve the problem of world poverty, yet it must still be carried out with intelligence, diligence, and social responsibility. For our part, we need to give alms as a way of reaching out and touching the suffering flesh of the poor. Touching, powerful words from Pope Leo on the significance of almsgiving. We have an image of the church presented by our Pope Leo. He describes, before concluding his exhortation, this image, and we will do well to take his words to heart. He says, Christian love breaks down every barrier, brings close those who were distant, unites strangers, and reconciles enemies. It spans chasms that are humanly impossible to bridge, and it penetrates to the most hidden crevices of society. By its very nature, Christian love is prophetic. It works miracles and knows no limits. It makes what was apparently impossible happen. Love is above all a way of looking at life and a way of living it. A church that sets no limits to love, that knows no enemies to fight, but only men and women to love, is the church that the world needs today. That's a powerful image. A church that sets no limits to love, that knows no enemies to fight, but only men and women to love, is the church that the world needs today. The final words of the Apostolic Exhortation are the words addressed personally by Jesus, which become the words for Pope Leo of each of us as we reach out with heartful gestures of closeness and support to the poor. The poor will realize that through our efforts, Jesus says to them, Dilexi Te, I have loved you. My dear sisters and brothers, Pope Leo XIV's first apostolic exhortation, Dilexi Te, I have loved you, speaks to all communities, speaks to all in religious life that choose to live alongside the poor, and specifically for us, Redemptorists and the entire Redemptorist family, who have embarked on this year as the year of mission, who have chosen as part of our sexennial theme to live as missionaries of hope in the footsteps of the Redeemer, who have begun, as it were, the 300th anniversary of the birth of St. Gerard, the man who incarnated love of Jesus in love for the poor. And having just read or continuing to read Communicanda 2 from the General Government, let us cross over to the other side. This exhortation will enable us Redemptorists, who have the poor at the very heart of our charism, to discover their richness and all that they have and can give to the world, to the church, and to our congregation today. And so I wish to recall for all of us Redemptorists two constitutions, number 4 and number 5. Number 4 says, among groups of people more in need of spiritual help, they will give special attention to the poor, the deprived, and the oppressed. The evangelization of these is a sign of messianic activity, Luke 4:18. And Christ, in a certain sense, wished to identify himself with them. Matthew 25:40. Constitution 5. Preference for situations where there is pastoral need, that is, for evangelization in the strict sense, together with the choice in favor of the poor, is the very reason why the congregation exists in the church and is the badge of its fidelity to the vocation it has received. Indeed, the congregation's mandate to evangelize the poor is directed to the liberation and salvation of the whole human person. The members have the duty of preaching the gospel explicitly and of showing solidarity with the poor by promoting their fundamental rights to justice and freedom. The means employed must be effective and at the same time consistent with the gospel. I believe, my dear sisters and brothers, that this exhortation will make us Redemptorists once again take up our constitutions and statutes and recommit ourselves, as Pope Leo XIV invites us, to care for the poor in proclaiming the good news of abundant redemption to them. Dilexi Te is indeed a very rich apostolic exhortation because it offers an overview of everything that the Church has done and continues to do, and should continue to do toward and with the world's poorest. It speaks forcefully to the Church today, at a time when many are excluded and marginalized. Truly, this is a document to be read, to be meditated on, to be studied, but above all, to be put into practice. The timing of this document is very significant, right in the midst of the Jubilee year for consecrated life. The document recalls everything that we as religious communities have given and continue to give in this area of care and service of the poor. Therefore, it is an invitation to recommit ourselves as consecrated men and women, and for us Redemptorists called to proclaim good news to the poor, to commit ourselves evermore with hope and concreteness to the cause of the poor. By encountering the poor, we encounter Christ. The Church walks with the poor, not for them, as if she has already all the answers, but rather walks with them, listening to their desires, their dreams, and the beauty that they hold in themselves. Finally, the words that echo for me in my heart and in my mind are: the encounter with the poor, especially those on the margins, is an encounter with Christ, our Lord and Redeemer. May the words of this very first apostolic exhortation of our Holy Father, Pope Leo XIV, Dilexi Te, I have loved you, be our own words as we gaze into the eyes of the poor and reach out to care for them.